by members of the Blue Ridge Democratic Socialists of America. How do I go? Okay. So upcoming events in our chapter and beyond, Workers and the World Unite, the kickoff to pass the PRO Act starts tomorrow at 5 p.m. There is a bit.ly link. Wait a second. And we're having our general meeting Monday, March the 15th at 7 p.m. And it's also open to everybody. And then Virginia Western at YDSA will be talking about their Cancel Student Debt campaign, which is a national campaign, Saturday, March 20th at 7 p.m. So 2 weeks from now. So more information about Workers and the World Unite, DSA campaign to launch to pass the PRO Act and win a Green New Deal. The speakers are Naomi Klein. She wrote something called the Shock Doctrine and a lot of other things. The Shock Doctrine is basically, she puts forth the tenet of the idea about disaster capitalism. So like whenever an expected or unexpected event happens that's really big, and one of the examples she uses is Hurricane Katrina, oftentimes government will put forward this broad austerity measure. So like after Hurricane Katrina, what officials in Louisiana did was start charter schools instead of, building back houses that had been flooded or repairing the levees. Sarah Nelson, who's the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, and then Jamal Bowman, who is a United States representative in New York's 16th House District. So Democratic Socialists of America overview, the roots trace back to before World War I. And as the Socialist Party of America, and then in the Civil Rights era, Students for a Democratic Society. And it was founded in 1982 as a merger. So it was originally the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and a New American Movement. And since 2016, our membership has skyrocketed from 5,000 to over 90,000. And I am going to hand it over to Ben, and he's going to talk about why do we pay dues?
Well, it's a good question, and it's actually something that a lot of people ask, because a lot of groups they think of as just volunteers and that's it. But we're trying to really organize people, and to do that, that does involve money. We have to pay for campaigns, we have to pay for websites, we have to, in a lot of cases, pay organizers, and to actually get this work done, we have to pay for technology. There's a lot of expenses involved in doing these things. And as a DSA member, when you pay dues, if you have a chapter like us, so we're all in the Blue Ridge area, and we get a part of that to fund things like websites and the stuff that we're trying to get moving right now is a very new chapter. It also allows us to be completely independent of outside influence. We're funded by our members, and that's it. And we determine what we want to do as a chapter and as an organization based on what our members want to do as chapter members and part of our organization. So we're not, there's not a risk there of outside influence that people don't agree with. And just from an organizing standpoint, buy-in means that people are invested in something. If you're actually willing to put up, whether it's a $20 fee a year because you're a student, or it's a $50 fee a year because you can afford it. Once you commit that and actually commit some money, it gets people more involved. And that's what we want. This isn't something where we want people that don't get involved in the process and don't want to participate. We want people that are ready to fight for socialism in America and make it happen. And that's a really big part of how we get that to happen.
So organized power is organized, no, organized money is organized power. Um, so now we're going to start off on what is socialism, and I'm going to preclude on what is capitalism. So capitalism is basically the private ownership of the means of production by a group of people known as the capitalists. Um, they own stuff as like lands, hotels, restaurants, stores, factories, anything where goods and services are produced. And so there's the capitalist class in their own ballroom, and the workers are under there, struggling. I think this is an IWW illustration from the last century. So in some ways, like, the fashions have changed, but the relational dynamics between capitalists and workers haven't changed. So workers sell their labor to capitalists, and they buy food, shelter, and clothing and other commodities on the market. And capitalists are selling these things on the market for profit. So it so instead of like redistribution of whatever, it's actual, they are yeah, they are, sorry, I'm brain farting. They are selling, yeah, they are not making things for perceived need. They are making things to to maximize on profit. So I say all the time to myself, why the fuck do some of these things go on? Then I say to myself, the next point you see here, M plus C equals M prime. So money, which the capitalists have, is money, and then plus C. So M is the initial investment. C is like, yeah, M, the initial investment, the labor work, materials to make those goods. So, like, I don't know, you make a sandwich at a restaurant. You have to have somebody to make the sandwich. You need the bread, the meat, the cheese, the whatever. So the restaurateur is selling that sandwich. But instead of just getting back exactly what they've put in, they want to get more. So that's what M prime is. The prime is what drives it. So when you see it, the working class and the capitalist class interests are, already opposed to each other. So working class people, they want to eat, and they only want to work as much as they have to, and the capitalists are interested in this M prime. So if nothing else you get from this lecture or from just me talking, other people will probably do a better job. Just remember M prime. Now, what is socialism? So instead of like private ownership of the means of production, there is not a capitalist class. So workers own the means of production, and they decide how much gets produced, how much work, what is needed, what is necessary, and production of goods and services according to need of society and not for profit. So it is not MCM prime, it is MCMCMCMCMCM forever. And now on to what is democratic socialism. Who had this?
Hey, that's me.
Yes.
Hey everyone, I'm Greg, he and him. talking about what is democratic socialism here. Basically, what we're talking about is organizing society in a way that maximizes human freedom, creativity, and happiness. So I've broken that down into some important rights to the idea here. We got rights of self-determination includes the right to be represented democratically by the government, with the caveat being that's free from the influence of capital. So this is the democracy part. We have that in the United States now. However, the wealthy class can heavily influence the government as it is now. And so what we're talking about is the right to be represented democratically without that interference. And it's also about the right to be represented democratically in your workplace, which was usually done through unions and cooperative workplaces. We also believe in certain material rights, which would be like the idea that housing, access to food and water, and healthcare is all a fundamental human right. And that as a worker, we should all own an equal share of the organization that we work in, and therefore we should also have an equal share of the profit from it. So this is all talking about how all humans really have the same inherent values. They go beyond their ability to produce capital. So it's not just about how much money an individual can make. And that all this should be without regard to race, ethnicity, gender identity, sex, anything else like that, religious, anything like that. It's the idea that we are all truly equal and everyone deserves life, liberty, equality, solidarity, and happiness. To get a little bit more into it, when we're talking about socialism, it's about social ownership as opposed to private ownership of the means of production, which can be achieved in a number of different ways, but primarily we can break that down as social ownership through the government control of industries and natural monopolies, which we sort of see to an extent now, but we'd like to expand that. Things like who creates the currency, who controls the financial institutions, electricity production, telecommunications, road, railways, water, education, and so on. That's all a form of social ownership, which we would like to expand. And then also, more importantly, worker ownership of their own workplaces, which we'd like to achieve through strong unions with complete buy-in to the unions and cooperative organizations, who then get to elect their own leadership in their organizations and then direct where the profits from these companies go as they see fit. So they can direct the profits back to themselves, they can reinvest them in expanding their organization, whatever they want. The point is democracy. And finally, it's the recognition that as a human species, our reliance on the earth is fundamental to our survival. And so we must obviously protect those systems. And I thought of this earlier too. I didn't put it in the slides, but it's what we're talking about with democratic socialism is also about what it's not. And so what we're trying not to be is like the Soviet Union and North Korea and certain authoritarian single party government organizations. We're not that. What we're trying to have is true democracy among all people, where they have control over their own destinies and their own workplaces and their governments. So anyways, that's all I got for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. That was really great. So I'm going to talk about what is and who defines the common good. So here's a picture of the Green New Deal, one of the campaign posters. So the Green New Deal, if you've not heard about it, it was introduced by Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2018. And it was basically a mass jobs program to get into green energy, green technology, and also, the New Deal in the 30s was a massive jobs program. This is a jobs program, and it ensures a just transition for people who work in fossil fuel sectors or adjacent to fossil fuel sectors. So, yeah. But anyways, to talk more about this, so who defines the common good? So what is good for people and the planet? So capitalism relies on cheap inputs in the form of labor and nature to make its cheap goods, the system consistently drives down both environmental and labor costs. So the C and MCM prime, always trying to drive down that so you can get more M prime. That's what capitalism, that is the fundamental equation of capitalism. So the cost of minimizing environmental damage rather than cutting corners to beat the competition. So yeah, not having, like we saw in Texas, de deregulated power grids that weren't winterized at all because they were like, oh, it's Texas, blah blah blah. Texas will not be able. Texas never has cold weather. Well, they had cold weather a few weeks ago, and instead of, being connected to the rest of the United States with the power grid so they can surge extra electricity to Texas while they were, having colder temperatures than usual, they were, power utilities were shut off. And as a result, people were getting thousands of dollars of bills, and these energy executives were licking their chops. And I just want to preface it that over 80% of Texas relies on fossil fuels. So it was not a fallacy of windmills that messed this up. And so the quality of life over the quantity of things. Capitalism began by enclosing public and common resources for private benefit and dispossessing their previous users. So, like, where capitalism really, like, the ground zero for capitalism, we say, is like northern Italy with the financial sector in the Renaissance, and then England with the rise of mills. How capitalist class got so many mill workers in those big cotton mills, like in Manchester, was well through colonialism and trading cheap labor from the Americas for cotton. Um, and Also, they forcibly removed tenants on land that was a part of the commons, um, land that wasn't like technically owned by a lord or a whatever or a vassal. So the collective ownership of the means of production would include common ownership of land, ocean, and atmosphere. And in a socialist society, using scientific knowledge about ecological capacity to manage and regulate use of those spaces. So when 97 to 98% of scientists say climate change is something that we need to do something about, we aren't having to read what fossil fuel CEOs think about that. Um, Instead, it's the like, okay, this is the problem. What do we do for this? So, how does socialism come into being? There's-
Um, yeah. So I'm Grayson Priest, he, him. Um, One of the main things that we can do um, to overcome capitalism and bring socialism into being is unionizing and striking where we work, because the people who own the means of production can't really use the means of production by themselves. They need all of us who are more in the working class. Um, but any individual can't just say, "Hey, I'm going to quit my job because the conditions are bad, because one person's not going to make a difference." So you have to work with people to um, overcome those harsh working conditions. And one of something that can really help is showing solidarity with other people who are unionizing in different companies. So if you know people who are unionizing elsewhere, support them. If they're striking, maybe help them or try to help them pay for things so that they can strike longer and have a greater effect. And then they will most likely support you in return when you unionize and strike against, yes, solidarity breeds solidarity, like Ben said. So the more you help others, the more they will help you back. And the more people are working together to fight against the bourgeoisie, the more we will get done. All right, so I think Greg was talking earlier about how our voting system is, technically democratic in some ways, but it really has a lot of problems. One being for the presidential election, of course, the Electoral College. I don't think I need to elaborate much on that, but the big problem that most people don't realize how big of an effect it has is just the amount of money that corporations can use to support the people they want to get into office or to advertise against people they don't want in office. And that money's not just going to go away, and corporations aren't just going to decide to let the working class win. And we definitely don't really have the the money to support and overcome that very easily. So, or to overcome the advertising. So the best way to get people to support your cause as a socialist is to show them what it means to be a socialist, to help them with whatever's going on in their lives, and just to support them and show solidarity, whether it be they got fired and need help finding a job, or even people in your community who are homeless, helping at like food banks, just anything that you can do to help others. Like Ben said earlier, again, solidarity breeds solidarity, and that's the most effective way that we can overcome capitalism.
All right. So the question is, how does class struggle build working class power? To answer that question, you could take a moral argument and say that every group in the minority needs more power. Everybody understands that. But to make it sink in and to help people understand a little bit more, we can take a more practical approach to answering that question. This approach doesn't discount any one group, but looks at it from a more practical standpoint. So why is class organizing a viable political strategy? There's two factors. The first one is diagnosing the injustices of a modern society, which one would be, or in a modern society, there's two items that are absolutely essential. There's one, guarantee of material security, which is things like having an income, housing, basic health care, and the second is being freedom from social domination, or the freedom to make key decisions for yourself. This lack of freedom puts us under the thumb of those with the power to set work hours, set utility rates, and input in writing laws and regulations. those with the societal controls routinely benefit only the ones who control at the expense of those, the working class, who are without. And if we can go to the next slide. We go to number 3. All right. So it makes sense that the first step in reform is to construct society in a more fair and humane manner by reducing insecurity and material deprivation in as many people's lives as possible. And if we can go back to number 2. There have been successes over the years like voting rights, civil rights, and increasing the minimum wage, but not without political opposition from the corporatists, bankers, and industrialists alike. That brings us to the power of the working class. None of those aforementioned reforms come about without one key element, and that's mobilization of the working class. Mobilization can take many forms, but they all center around interrupting the capitalist profit or money, and workers are the best conduit to achieving that. And that in my part.
Next, so what is internationalism?
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Stacy Hashjans, she, her. Internationalism it sounds like a little bit off topic, but it is related to socialism as sort of like a facet of socialism. And they're very heavily related and benefit one another. So if we can get to our next slide. There we go. All right. So internationalism is the belief in the political and economic cooperation among nations for the promotion of the common good of the people, which is something we've talked about a lot tonight. And it's not just the common good of the wealthy or even the middle class, but of, you know, all people. It is a major component of our socialist political theory. So essentially the mutual long-term interests for the workers of the world are more important than short-term disputes between our nations, which those disputes are usually instigated by those in charge anyway, without consideration for those long-term interests of the working class, i.e. human civil rights, self-determination, environmental preservation, which could destroy our planet, etc. So obviously this is the opposite and contrasted with nationalism, which is a huge favorite of capitalists and fascists. They benefit from nationalism, which is that huge pride in your own country, promoting your own culture and interests. In capitalism, we're talking like the economic class, rather than our physical borders, cultures, languages, or race. That economic class is the main thing that divides us, people around the world. And nationalism truly benefits any given country's dominant economic class. Nationalism makes that dominant economic class more powerful, the people at the top. So nationalism is more of a blind for the working class. It's a way to create blind devotion for when your country wants its working class to kill the working class of another country. Internationalism is, you know, the opposite of that. Policies of internationalism are basically eliminating economic and political competition between nations, ending wars, and stringent anti-imperialism. The goal, and we'll talk more about anti-imperialism. The goal in internationalism is not for your country to be the most wealthy or powerful, but to ensure the prosperity of all global citizens. So if we as democratic socialists wish to work towards peace and the common good for people here in the United States, we truly are not going to be able to achieve that without making the goal to include all the people of the world. So here on slide 2, an end to imperialism, which is what internationalism strives for. Imperialism is basically the dominion of one nation over another. It could be through diplomacy or a monarchy or military force, among other avenues, and basically extends political and economic access and control of the imperialist nation. So we're guilty of it here in the United States. Some of our greatest allies are guilty of it. Internationalism is anti-imperialist and therefore aims to end all colonialism and foreign domination. Those things that which just so happen to benefit a capitalist government, which wants to gain power and profits from the extraction of resources from those nations. So like I said, we are guilty of colonialism and imperialism. So first we must look at ourselves. There are around 800 US military bases scattered around the world. And we tell ourselves it's for good reason to spread peace and democracy, but do the people of those countries really want us there? Or does it feel more like occupation? So to maintain those bases, including the purchase of artillery that we're dropping and using in other countries, that takes an exorbitant amount of money, which would absolutely be a better use directed towards social welfare here at home, which goes back to what we've been talking about today about an organized use of the money democratically voted on. So even after our military inventions, after our military interventions, how often do we succeed at maintaining peace and democracy in those places? Not as often as we actually end up promoting the interests of business and take control of that nation's resources at the expense of the people who live there. Working class solidarity around the world just isn't going to exist until the working classes of all the nations that we exploit cease to view us as their abusers, which is what they're going to do as long as we're holding on to them. Next slide. And so speaking to that, creating that international working class movement really is crucial in furthering any socialist cause here at home. The fact that racism and inequality still persist here in the US is directly linked to the fact that our country feels as if it is necessary and right to exploit, interfere, and wage war around the world, knowing full well who will be fighting and dying. Soldiers from working class families and poverty-stricken communities. Vietnam was the first American war where troops were not formally segregated, yet the de facto segregation actually continued through the inequities that they faced, like more frequent court-martials, punitive discharges, and the casualties. Also in Vietnam, our government's leaders spoke of the Vietnamese citizens as subhuman in order to rationalize their murder. So like I said earlier, like the racism and stuff like that helps them to achieve their cause, and socialism and internationalism aim to get rid of all of that. Imperialism promotes all ideas of class hierarchy and racism, so we have to be anti-imperialist. As long as we continue to allow the violence created by American foreign policy, the violence that is proliferated in our own country against our own citizens by the government and the police is going to continue. And that kind of makes me feel like I need to address a little bit, is internationalism then inherently pacifist? Sure, internationalists and a lot of people, I'm sure, would like to see world peace and an end to senseless mass violence, but there are some questions involved that you have to ask yourself. Is the fighting to maintain injustice or to squash injustice? Whose idea is it to fight, and for what cause? Is it to make the fat cats fatter or to free the mice from the terror of being eaten by the fat cats? Think of the example of World War II, where the Allies fought in part to release the grasp of fascism from the throat of Western Europe, which could not be excused. So the imperial violence of other nations cannot be excused. Post-war, it's not like everything was sunshine and daisies since then. We definitely have been involved in a lot of military interventions that are completely, since World War II, I've heard like people say we haven't been in a just fight since then. So it's not like America is anywhere clear of being in the right. But to kind of end my time here, the short answer is no. Socialism doesn't, and internationalism don't stand for just sitting idly and waiting for equality to find us, because it never will find us. We have to struggle for it. We have to fight for it. And that's my time.
And what is intersectionality?
All right, thank you, Stacy. That was very good. And so I'm going to reel it back in a little bit to what's going on in the U.S. for this, but it's very related to a lot of the things Stacy was just talking about. But when we talk about intersectionality, we're looking at all of these overlapping things that keep individuals and classes at the bottom at so that capitalists can basically exploit their labor or exploit them in some way to make more money. Next one, Joseph, please. So intersectionality, really what it means is that oppression comes from lots of different places and can affect you in lots of different ways. So, I am very fortunate to be a, straight cis white man, and I don't get affected by oppression in a lot of ways other people do. And it, you know, goes across gender, sexual orientation, all of these things, race, religion, ethnicity, and we need to consider all of that when we're looking at oppression and how we can deal with it. If we only focus on one thing, and this is something that socialism in a lot of ways in the past has been criticized on, is that we are focusing just on the working class. And while that's generally not ever really been true anyway, it's also something we need to avoid and make sure that we're recognizing that we can all be part of the working class, but someone that is also of a minority in race or in gender identity or religion or disability or some other factor, that's going to affect whether they are feeling this oppression in a different way or whether they have privilege in a different way. And none of these occur in isolation. They all overlap. Intersectionality tries to explain it, though, and I think the next slide will probably help me explain this a little bit. We don't look at it as stacking things. So it's not that, you as an individual have 3 oppressions happening to you, and I only have 1 oppression happening to me, and therefore we can't work together and look at it in the same way. The idea is that they compound and they interact in different ways. And a lot of this was built out of the Black feminist movement and the civil rights movement. And this came, I think, my understanding at least, is that a lot of this came out of fighting for women's suffrage. And a lot of Black feminists found that white feminists were not in any way open to the idea that it was different to be a Black woman than it was to be a white woman. And that built this whole idea that we're suffering different oppressions. Some of them are the same and we can work together. Some of them are different and we need you to understand that. And all of these things are intertwined in a lot of ways. And so the goal for socialism is to look at how they're intertwined and how we, when we're trying to organize as a working class, can take into account that, somebody that is in a different racial group or gender group or class group for me might be suffering in a different way than I am, and we need to consider that. And that's how we build a movement. So it started with the Black feminist movement. In feminism generally, there's still very similar ideas happening where fighting for example, like an equal wage and the gender pay gap is not the only issue that is involved there. We have to consider that there's other things going on and more we need to consider, and listen to the people that are trying to be part of our movement about what they need and where the inequalities really lie. But they can work together because it's, at the end of the day, solidarity means that, I can't imagine a socialist that wouldn't also be a feminist, and realistically, it's hard for me to imagine a feminist that wouldn't also want socialism, because we're really actually fighting for equity and equality at the end of the day, and that's our real end goal. Um, and so that includes things like racial equality. Anti-racism has gotten a lot more, I'd say, time in the press finally, and showing that just thinking that you're not a racist yourself is not enough. If we're trying to build a movement for equality, then we have to go out and fight the things that are preventing that. And economic equality is certainly a huge part of it, and it's built into capitalism. And if you all weren't there for our capitalism presentation, it's a big part of it how capitalism exploits being able to take advantage of any type of minority group, no matter what it is. And oppression, though, from an economic standpoint and by capitalists, is not the only type of racial oppression that exists. So when equity is our goal, we have to look at a broader picture than just the working class unity. And so it doesn't mean that while we're trying to unite everyone as the working class, because that's where our power is, that's where we can make major gains. We can say, well, we can shut down this economic system when we work together as a class. That doesn't mean ignoring that there's a lot of other fights going on at the same time. And a really good way to build solidarity is to say, hey, I see that you're struggling with this and you're organizing this. I'm going to help you with that, even though it's not, maybe if my main goal is to start a union at my job, but a lot of the people at my job are having a rally about some type of racial issue that they've had, go to that. Go help out your brothers and your sisters at your job. And that builds solidarity across a lot of these different lines that we're talking about, because they do all come together in the end. And so since our goal is to maximize everybody having actual freedom, being able to participate in the things that provide us happiness, that allow us to be creative, that allow us to have a fulfilling life, we can't do that if we ignore any group and what they're facing. And so I think to reach that goal, we really have to listen to the people that are most affected by a lot of these systems of oppression that some of us don't ever experience at all. And without recognizing them, it's a lot harder to fix them. And I think that's a really big part of the movement, is try to figure out how we can embrace everyone. And I think I'm a slide ahead of where we actually are. So that's what I was just talking about. But to reach these goals, we have to recognize that all of these things are intertwined, and economic oppression is a very big part of all of it. But something I'm going to talk about in the next section, I think, will help bear that out a little bit. So being against the capitalist system isn't enough for what I think our goals as socialists really are. But what we see is that in capitalism, we're always going to be fighting this capitalist class. So they have the money, they have the resources, they have the control and the ownership. And what they do is they hoard it, they extract wealth from everyone else and keep it for themselves. And that makes it very hard to fight them. And we're always going to see, when capitalists are in charge, this push to just increase profits at the expense of everything else. If we want equity and we want actual worker control, and that includes lots of different things, not like when we say the means of production, that means so much of the system. We want to be able to have workers have a say in, what their scheduling is, when they have to work, how much they have to work, what they get paid, how the production works, what the safety controls are in all of these places. And that's a big thing that we try to push for. And in capitalism, markets do not allow for that. It's not possible to have workers controlling any of that. And this just, the next slide, this is a real quick overview from our capitalist presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. The market as it exists in capitalism is used to control workers. So we'll see things like unemployment that has to exist. We have to have unemployed people, because if we don't have a replacement pool for anyone we want to fire. And that's kind of critical to how capitalism works, is if you don't like your job and you don't like what you're doing, you can get fired very easily, and you're very easy to replace as an individual. Once we organize, we get some of the control over that system. We get control over the profit, ideally, and we get control over what happens in our workplaces. And it improves everybody's situation within that environment. So the reason fighting just against capitalism is not enough, though, is that, so if we achieve social democracy, we take over, we get in charge, we take over the means of production, there are still a lot of problems that we have to solve. And this goes back very much to intersectionality. We can get rid of a lot of the capitalist class, and we'll still have issues where oppression is happening, where racism still exists, where sexism still exists, where ableism still exists, where all of these things are still issues. And the goal, I think, the long-term goal of getting involved in groups like DSA is trying to work even beyond that and say that, so we can get the working class on an even footing where everybody, has financial stability, they have housing stability, they have healthcare stability, they have these things that we think are fundamental. But there's still more to fight for beyond that. And capitalism exploits all of those systems, but it's not the only reason that they exist. And that also relates to things like when we talk about the Green New Deal and we talk about environmentalism, and why, people, the farther left you go, the more people care about things like, climate change and the environment, is because we recognize that they're, even beyond our working class struggles, we have to deal with a lot of these other problems in a different way as well. So why do we talk about it? And I think a lot of what we've covered is why we talk about it. Part of doing it in an event like this is it allows all of us to learn. I think all of us that are presenting these things probably learned at least something from it. And hopefully the people listening learned something from it as well. But there's a lot that goes on. So we know capitalism, I really like this, capitalism works until it doesn't. So we've had recessions. I mean, we have now lived through recessions, housing crises, banking crises, maybe not an actual depression. I guess it depends on how you define it and how old you are. But capitalism only ever works well for the capitalist class anyway. And some of these things are literally, so I can argue all day moral reasons we should be socialists, and we should be anti-capitalist, and we should be anti-racist, and we should be feminists. I can do that all day. But at the end of the day, a lot of the things that capitalism drives is literally going to destroy the planet, and we're not going to have anything to fight for because nothing's going to be left anyway. And I think a lot of us in DSA and a lot of us on the left in general believe that something better than that is possible. So that's why we're that's why we're fighting about this, and that's why we're talking about it.
Thank you, everybody who presented. Any discussion points or questions or?
I just wanted to say good job, everybody, for preparing these presentations, doing such a good job. I especially liked, ending it the way we did because, with a long presentation, it's easy to kind of like lose focus of, okay, but we're here to talk about why we're talking about it. And I think you wrapped it up really succinctly there, Ben, because we really do not just want to end capitalism. We want to end a lot of other problems with our planet. And, really the main goal is to just take care of one another. And currently the way that we function within our government and within the world just really doesn't do that. So it's all about, I'm really happy that we're talking about searching for a better goal.
And I want to add too that it should also be fun and social, and it should be about making friends and having a good time. There was a quote someone said, I forget who, and I forget what it was exactly, but they said something to the effect of like, "Oh, socialism doesn't work because it takes up too many free weekends." The idea being that it's a lot of work to just do all this stuff, and it is, but it should also be focusing on having a good time, making connections, building communities, all that good stuff, and not only just talking about abstract ideas, which are good, but
we left out the socializing and socialism.
ideally we can all hang out in person more in the future. So
Yeah.
that's all.
I agree. I think that's a very good point. And if anybody